Most people think wartime food came from annual crops, rows of potatoes, carrots, cabbages and grains planted every spring and scraped out of the soil by autumn. That story is incomplete. During World War II, especially in Europe and parts of North America, there was another category of food that quietly kept people alive when seed supplies failed, fuel was rationed, and labour was scarce. These were vegetables that behaved more like trees than garden plants. You planted them once, often before the war or early into it, and they produced reliable harvests year after year, sometimes for decades with very little intervention. They survived bombing, neglect and shortages because their strength was underground and perennial. Today, most people have never heard of them, or if they have, they assume they are curiosities rather than serious food. The question is not whether they worked. The historical record shows they did. The real question is why systems that performed so well under wartime pressure were allowed to vanish from mainstream agriculture once peace returned. Perennial vegetables were a strategic food source during wartime scarcity. The vegetables that grew like trees were not fantasy crops or experimental novelties. They were, well known to farmers before industrial agriculture took over. Perennial kales, tree collards, asparagus, artichokes, sea kale, sorrel and walking onions were all grown extensively in Europe before and during the Second World War. Their advantage was simple and, honestly, quite decisive. Once established, they returned every year without replanting, without new seed, and often without cultivation. In wartime, when seed shipments were disrupted and chemical inputs were unavailable, this really mattered. A mature asparagus bed could feed a family every spring for, 20 years. Tree collards could be cut repeatedly through winter when other greens failed. Artichokes produced both food and calorie-dense flower buds while also serving as living fences. These plants stored energy in deep root systems, not in fragile annual growth. Even when gardens were damaged by shelling or, abandoned temporarily, the plants returned. That made them ideal for uncertain conditions where, continuity could not be guaranteed. Tree kales and perennial greens fed cities when supply chains broke down. One of the most overlooked examples is perennial kale, particularly varieties like Daubenton's kale and tree collards. These plants, you see, grow into woody shrubs rather than soft annual greens. In Britain and parts of Northern Europe, they were common before the war and honestly, quietly essential during it. Families propagated them by cuttings rather than seed, which meant one plant could create dozens more. They produced edible leaves almost year-round, tolerated frost, and did not require ploughing. During the Second World War rationing, these kales, really filled the gaps when cabbage crops either failed or were redirected to the military. They weren't exactly glamorous, but, they were dependable. A single plant, once it was established, could actually provide greens for several years. Asparagus and artichokes, interestingly enough, functioned as a sort of long-term food infrastructure. Asparagus was really treated more like an investment rather than just another seasonal crop. Farmers understood quite well that the first 2 years were really about establishment, not harvest. After that, though, the returns were steady and, well, quite predictable. Wartime agriculture manuals, you see, emphasized asparagus beds as a kind of insurance against seed shortages. The same was true of globe artichokes, which were grown extensively in places like France and Italy. They produced edible buds, plenty of biomass for compost or even livestock, and, honestly, survived neglect better than most vegetables. These crops, you know, really blurred the line between what we'd call a vegetable and what you'd find in an orchard. They weren't just planted on a whim, but once they were established, they reduced labour and input requirements dramatically. The disappearance of these crops wasn't, well, because they failed. It was actually because they didn't fit the post-war economic model. Industrial agriculture needed annual purchasing of seed, fertilizer, fuel, and equipment. Perennial vegetables honestly undermined that model. After the war, agricultural policy really favoured uniformity, mechanization, and crops that could be easily quantified, subsidized, and traded globally. Perennial vegetables just didn't scale well into monocultures or fit neatly into commodity markets. The practical lesson is straightforward. Anyone with land, even a small homestead, can reintroduce these systems. The first step is choosing 1 or 2 perennial vegetables suited to your climate. Asparagus remains one of the most accessible. The key is thinking in terms of permanence rather than seasons. Plant once, protect during establishment, and then let the plant do the work. This is exactly how wartime growers thought, and it is just as relevant today in an era of rising costs and unstable supply chains. These vegetables were not romantic throwbacks. They were strategic assets. They reduced dependency, spread risk, and provided food when systems failed. Their disappearance tells us less about their value and more about the priorities of the systems that replaced them. If you care about history, resilience, and practical knowledge that has already been tested under extreme conditions, these crops deserve renewed attention. They fed people when it mattered most, and they can do so again. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who still remembers how food used to be grown, and stay with us as we continue uncovering the practical history that modern systems would rather you forget.